Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And most of the incidents in the database come from Google alerts. But in addition to those Google alerts, I also see some pretty interesting papers. So a couple weeks ago, I saw a paper that was titled "The Threat is Now: Choreography, Temporality, and the Active Shooter Drill." And those are words that speak to me, because anybody who's listened to this knows that I'm a big academic nerd. I'm also somebody who extensively studies school shootings. So I wanted to get in touch with the author of this paper and have a discussion about this paper because it's really completely different from a lot of the research we see in this space. So the guest today is Shannon Woods, who's a dance artist, a writer, an educator, and an administrator. She's a PhD candidate in performance at public practice, the University of Texas in Austin, got her master's from New York University Tisch School of Arts in performance studies. And the focus of her research, which is, much different than the security practitioners that are usually on the show, is about dance and performance. Because what you can have is this intersection of choreography with our concepts of public safety and kind of the broader police state. Because what we have is these things like active shooter drills or lockdown drills, as Shannon describes them, are really performances of protection. And what we can do is look at the ways that a body moves in these performances of crisis. And that can be something that ultimately perpetuates a threat, which is very similar to back in episode 16 with Dr. Tahir Rahman, where we talked about the power of rehearsal and the power of practice. So without further ado, Shannon Woods, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for inviting me to be on this. It's really great to also meet and talk with you because, of course, I've used your database for my research. So, thank you for continuing this dialogue.
Excellent. So kind of before we get into this, because it's really unconventional to have somebody who's in the performance space doing work in this, we think of, hard sciences, the social sciences, the kind of science of security as the disciplines that would be in this space. But before we get into that, I mean, who are you? Where did you grow up? What got you interested in dance to the point where you would have a master's and PhD studies in the performance arts?
So I grew up in Massachusetts, and I grew up a pretty serious ballet dancer. So I was in pre-professional programs through middle school and high school, and eventually got my undergrad. I got a double major in dance with a ballet concentration and in English. So I still like practice dance but I'm writing a lot more about it now these days. But I've just been, into dance and in the arts like my whole life. After I, went off to college, I spent about almost 10 years in New York, and just lived as a dancer freelance, was just doing the audition cycle, doing the grind, working a lot of jobs as like a fact checker and a manager and a teacher before I got my master's in performance studies at NYU. So really like ballet has been my major, I guess like my home base, my like kind of how I grew up, and just as it's really stayed with me through all the years. But on that, I think it also is kind of how I started becoming interested in school security, right? Like I think it seems like a huge leap from ballet to security, but ballet as a form is very political. Like there is a lot of history to pull apart with like the movement vocabulary, the performances, who's in a company, who's the director. And of course it was my first love. But then when I started to kind of discover that, as my research went on in higher education, I just like kept going and performing. I really couldn't look away about how, the way the body can absorb systems of control under the guise of choreography. So that really kind of became a kernel that when I started getting into the field of performance studies, which is kind of the huge field, like kind of not a huge field, it's a medium sized field, but it is a large swath of different research disciplines. So there's a lot of different entry points you can have with it. But that really became the kernel of how I started looking at, um, school shootings, active shooter drills in particular, as pieces of choreography and performance.
Can you break down what choreography means, both in kind of the classical dance context, but then also kind of choreography within a space or society?
Yes, I would love to. So choreography literally, I think that it translates to like the writing of dance, right? So it's like some kind of transcription of dance. And like this has its roots like way back into, I think, 17th century courts of France, like certain like feuillet notations, which it was a way to like write down and record movements from kind of this bird's eye view of like where court dances would take place. And then there's a lot of different kinds of ways and methods, especially like in Western dance practices, that uh, recorded movement for like to be read again and then like reperformed. So it really is just kind of like writing down movement. And there's a lot of different like, complexities to that, because a lot of, you can't really recreate a performance twice. Like it's kind of like stepping in the same river twice, or same way with choreography. But so like choreography could kind of like expand to also kind of mean how movement becomes reproduced, and then how movement becomes reproduced on different bodies, and how that will be affected, and those experience would be affected by identity, by like society, by cultural expectations. So now in like dance studies at large, choreography kind of has exploded in meaning to, kind of be a tool to understand a lot of different power dynamics, between like a choreographer, someone who makes movement, and then somebody who is moving, the dancer. So it's like kind of become like another term to understand like how power is disseminated, and like and has a stamina along with it, where like movement can be reproduced. So and yeah, any questions about that? I know that's kind of like a large leap from
Well,
the
I
next.
think for the uninformed person about kind of dance studies or the power of dance, you think of a performance as kind of an individual expression, but really at its heart, it's a system of very meticulous control, and there are certain people within that chain of control that have a lot of power to direct the decisions and expressions of the performance.
Right, right. And of course, too, where there's power, there is resistance. So there are like different dance studies scholars who are like, what kind of different movements are kind of pushing against those traditional notions of choreography, where like, I'm going to map out how you're going to move, and then you're going to do that choreography and perform it, right? For an audience, for tickets, like, but there are different movement practices that are directly kind of like counter to that, where it's coming from more free expression. And usually those kinds of dance forms are political too, because yeah, they are countering some kind of traditional notion of choreography, or refocusing it in a way where their bodies have more agency.
So taking that into the classroom, which is your paper about the choreography and temporality of the active shooter drill, can you translate that into kind of the school terms? Who's writing the script? Who's the director? Who's the performer? What's the purpose of the performance?
Right, right. So yeah, that's a question that like, right, it keeps me up at night. That's like it drives a lot of this paper and my dissertation research. But um, that's kind of, therein lies the problem that I'm trying to tease apart in the paper, is that, right, I'm thinking about choreography in this sense as an emergency operation plan, like an EOP, or signs that we see around that are like either run, hide, fight in schools, or even like when we're in a parking garage, like even outside a school system, and it says lock your car, hide your belongings, like things that like guide
Movement.
safety, and yeah, guide safety, movement, and decisions in public space. So uh and who is writing those, right? Like a lot of times, maybe like in schools, it could be administrators, it could be teachers working on EOPs. Not always is there a police officer kind of writing those, but I think police officers do come in, like kind of act as like consultants, or they kind of like they measure the efficacy of like what a school has going on, is in case like of some kind of emergency. So the like I see, right, like the a lot of these choreographies are coming from the advice and guidance of law enforcement, and I have measured by their efficacy by law enforcement as well. And I write these trainings for future, I don't know, for teachers or for students for drills. They kind of, right there are, it is like law enforcement's choreography that's kind of disciplining this future instance of panic. And at face value, right, like that's what it is, and that's what, and of course we can't say that's not important. It is important to know what to do. This is like a very real, right, this is a very
Well, it's debatable. Yeah.
right, like it's like, but it's really interesting that we're in this point, at this point of tension where it's like we need this training, but at the same time we're asking kind of harmful systems of like policing young people, surveillance, and different carceral logics in schools to be just regular necessities. So although yes, training is important, I think we have to look at, like, again, who's the choreographer, who's the maker, who's the mover, and then who suffers as a result of having these things as part of their educational experience.
So your educational experience is probably right in the heart of the institutionalization of kind of lockdown and security procedures. I was in school, younger grade school in the 90s, pre-Columbine. Columbine is something that occurred at the end of middle school. Virginia Tech for me is something that occurred when I was already in college. But the concept of having, mandated lockdown drills, every year or multiple times a school year was something that I didn't experience in my education. I experienced an actual shooting, which was the Washington, D.C. sniper, which targeted random people all over the D.C. area for three weeks while I was in high school, including a middle school kid at the neighboring county where he was shot getting out of his mother's car in the morning. And so there was a lot of kind of directed movement around that, but not with purpose or not with a script. Things like running in a zigzag, like evacuating the school in small groups of people. That was all really ad hoc. And it wasn't until the mid 2000s and really after Sandy Hook that the idea of the lockdown and the lockdown rehearsal was institutionalized. Kind of, what was your experience in school with that? When did school shootings become something that was really kind of a defining part of your experience?
So Columbine happened when actually I was in kindergarten. So it is kind of interesting that that happened, and like I remember kind of like a switch for when teachers would say, right, or it used to be kind of like discourse that like school is the safest place you can be, or for a kid, right? Like if thinking about maybe what's going at home, maybe you can get food, a hot lunch, like, it's a safe place. But then like I remember that switch being like, maybe it's not. So Columbine was in, about like my really at the beginning of my school journey. And then we really in Heights all the way through high school. I graduated high school in 2011, so right before Sandy Hook. So like there really weren't quarterly or even like yearly kind of lockdown drills. I think I remember doing a lockdown drill once, but I did have one teacher who had a background with the Boston Police Department teaching Spanish to law enforcement officers, and he was my Spanish teacher. And he had a choreographed what is pretty much close to what they're teaching kids now, back in like 2008, 2009. And we all were like, oh, this guy, like, he's just whatever. This is just him. He just thinks he's a cop. But it was really interesting in hindsight, where like we sat in rows of desks. And if you sat in a particular desk next to a door that like went to an adjacent classroom, you knew it was your job to take 2 empty desks next to you. They would always remain empty the whole school year, and stack them up to make a barricade. And then, his door was always locked the whole day, all of class, which also wasn't something so common, but now is a lot more common in schools where doors automatically lock classroom doors or anything like that. That was new. That was just a him thing. And he said, I'm not going to be out in the hallway fiddling with a lock while an intruder is here. And like still right at this time, it was happening, but it really just wasn't, there wasn't a need, right, to choreograph, or for at least to have us rehearse. And even though I think in my freshman year of high school, there was some kind of active threat. There was like vandalism that happened around my high school, and like a threat was made about a particular date. And not much, it's interesting in hindsight to think where not much was done, again, like choreographically about like, what are we going to do? But we just ended up not going to school that day. And
the show was canceled.
Yeah. And it was like, they're like, we're just not going to show up. But and that's interesting also to think of how that might not hold up right today, because I think there's a lot more attention paid to like what students might be like threat assessment programs, right? That are like, what are kids doing? What are they saying that might cause an alarm? That didn't really exist in the same way either. It was just like, just don't go to school. But it's not going to hold up anymore.
So when lockdown drills weren't a core part of your K through 12 education, at what point did you make this connection between performance as a science and the lockdowns as this area for research?
I think like the practical answer, was part of my work at NYU, was I really started thinking about it, because I think at that time, right, I was really, knee deep in performance studies, thinking about how like performance could be better, or could be used to better analyze, understand, and interact with social and cultural life. And I just had happened at the same time and maybe you listened to this story on This American Life. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, yeah.
Fill the audience in on that.
Yeah. The This American Life, it was a podcast released about a year after the Parkland, Florida shooting, that was interviewing teachers about these drills and just like how it works, what's happening. And I just found it just like very compelling, just about how, the number, like they mention in that the biggest question they get during these trainings, especially about like what's going to happen in the classroom, or like what's going to be the protocol with your teachers, if you're in a physical classroom. But then the number one question that kids ask is, what do I do if I go to the bathroom? And the directive, right, the choreographic imperative, right, like this is what you must do in response of this situation, was just run as fast as you can. And I just like, that was a very very compelling, very sobering, of just how important, it's like this whole kind of like way I'm like looking at these things about choreography, it is a lens, but it also is very much a real thing that is now becoming a generational like movement on all these bodies and all these young people. And right, like while it is a lens, there are lasting effects that are really going to, that are, this movement that is entering people's bodies everywhere. And it's something to pay attention to. But I just found it compelling, kept going it. And I thought, I was like, it's just like it's just research. Maybe it has to do with ballet, but I do have a lot of family also in law enforcement. So I think like, maybe this is just like it's just something about having their family behind you, right? Like, even though I'm very like, I am critical, right, of law enforcement and its uses and how it's being executed, but like, I have tons of family members or younger cousins who are now deputy sheriffs, people who were sergeants for the NYPD. And I think it has to do with just like, I don't know, generational, something got passed down. I don't know.
Well, there's a lot of of performance that exists in policing. If you think about uniforms, the way that an officer stands, the way that actions are choreographed, the way that a traffic stop is trained, is all movement of the body and a performance in many ways to project power or project strength. What I think is interesting in your paper is that you have kind of a paradox where you direct bodies, through training to preempt a crisis, but at the same time, those rehearsals and those performances can be reinforcing some negative pieces. The school to prison pipeline, the way that a community is deemed to be dangerous, kind of this broader concept of the police state. Where do you see the performance as kind of contributing to those more negative attributes?
Yeah, I think right, like that's like the other side of that really difficult tension of like we need this training, but what, Um and I think like right, in the school to prison pipeline or the school to prison nexus is right, like just to put that out of the way, it's like the practices and procedures that begin as part of a student's education or their educational experience, and then they end up ushering young people, especially young people of color, into the criminal punishment system. So that I think like the fact that with these choreographies come a lot of hardware and a lot of police officers, a lot of policing and surveillance, right? Like now we see more metal detectors, AI object recognition, SROs as being like a major kind of like mainstay police officer that are in schools, right? That wasn't always the case, and like police officers really started entering schools during desegregation and during in especially in like Jim Crow South, right? So like there are all these factors that come with trying to, I don't know, provide or perform safety that really are putting all of those young people, black and brown, low income or disabled young people, as targets of criminalization as part of their everyday schooling.
And to back up on the school to prison pipeline, because that's a term that's been politicized, but in academic literature, there's very, very clear evidence of its existence. And that
Mhm.
has roots into back in 1994. The Safe Schools Act was the first federal legislation that would provide funding for police in local schools. And that was followed by the COPS program, which was more direct funding from the Department of Justice into schools. Prior to the 1990s, there had really been no pathway for federal dollars to go into physical police presence in schools. And then the empirical evidence from there is connected to that COPS grant funding was the requirement for schools to have zero tolerance discipline policies.
Right.
And so those two things become connected because the way to show program effectiveness starts to become arresting and suspending and expelling students. And there's very, very clear evidence from, education records, which are a strong data point that you can study, empirically. Evidence-based studies show that minority students and low-income students have been the most suspended and the most expelled and the most arrested students in schools since the implementation of those federal grant programs. So
Yeah.
that's the school to prison pipeline.
That's the numbers. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's the data. I mean, and it's part of right like this larger thing that we call the prison industrial complex, right? And that's right the all those overlapping industry and government entities, right, that are using policing, surveillance, and imprisonment, or like right if we're thinking about zero tolerance policing, surveillance, and removing from school, right, like which is same, it's similar, like right, like the way that like incarceration works and like zero tolerance works. It's like that's instead of rehabilitation, instead of education or resources, we're just going to remove the quote unquote bad person, and that will solve the problem. and then now we have like a huge mass incarceration problem in the US. I don't know. But anyways, it's just right, like all of this is like a part of the same system under kind of the same purview of the same entities. And
And
it's
that's
very,
the same with the school. With zero
yeah,
tolerance discipline, it's that there is the bad kid, and we have to remove the bad kid
yeah,
from the school so that they don't harm the rest of the school community.
yes.
What
There's
is often overlooked is
yeah,
when a kid is expelled or arrested as a juvenile, that is the strongest correlate to being a lifetime habitual offender and having multiple incarcerations. So removing a bad kid through force and power is creating a lifetime criminal.
yes, yes. These are right, like these are, this is why it's a nexus, right? It's almost like they call it a pipeline, but some activists call it a nexus or a complex. It is, these are overlapping systems that are in a lot, there aren't just they don't exist in their silos. They overlap and use each other to kind of recreate these powers.
So then in your paper, there are these kind of key concepts that come out of the performance of the lockdown drill, and they're around control, surveillance, and time.
Mm.
And some of my own context that I'm adding to this, because it's the connections I saw, is that control is you must follow. The lockdown drill is mandatory. It's mandated at the state level. It's mandated at the classroom level when the principal says we're doing it these days.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has to do it. Every teacher has to do it. Every student has to follow the direction of the teacher. In terms of surveillance, the drill doesn't just exist. It has to be observed. It has to be documented.
Mm-hmm.
In many places, it's a retired police officer who's being paid, even though they have no particular experience in this. There has to be an observer. There
Yeah.
has to be a surveiller. And then your final point on time, the drill itself has to be rapid movement, has to be fast, has to have a certain kind of frantic, panicked energy. But there's the larger kind of temporal piece of it is that the performance has to be continued. It has to be many times a school year. It has to be every school year. It
Mm.
has to be something that's ingrained and reinforced. It's the show that never goes off Broadway.
Yeah.
Can
Facts.
can you kind of break down more of the your thoughts around that control, surveillance, and time?
Yes, I think so I do argue a little bit in the paper that right, like the time is like a huge commodity, the ultimate commodity, and also the biggest threat of active shooter drills, the school safety. Um, there's like right, like the more practical piece where they're when you're under pressure and there's an emergency, time is of the essence. So you have to move quickly, efficiently, calmly, and make like decisions that are going to put you in a more favorable position. But what really is also key to these choreographies is right, it's not simply just the drills that get performed and watched and observed for for a situation that we may or may not happen. It's that a key part about a lot of these that is situational awareness. So that's like might be a familiar term to a lot of people depending on your backgrounds, but right, like that's the idea of you're never going to stop being aware of your surroundings, of what might be weird, of what is normal, what's okay. And that kind of idea that that's like a huge kind of part of like the training I received. I did Alice training for my dissertation work, but the idea that I forget who you might know, but I forget like who set up this system, but there's like living in the white, living in the yellow, the orange, red, and the black. It's like if you're living in the white, it's like right, you're sitting back, you're on your phone, you're not really aware of anything. And then you always kind of want to be like in the yellow, where it's like you're relaxed, but you're alert. And like, those are very different kind of right, like affects, very different movements, very different energies. And right, and that is a choreography in itself. So the choreography always has to be happening. Like even though you're not there, there isn't an attacker, or you're not in the drill, you're still in school, and the choreography still is predicated on you being aware.
So on kind of that awareness, what's different about school shootings is the asymmetrical nature of them.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is that it's not the school with an advantage against an outside attacker.
Mm.
Most school shootings are committed by current or former students or people who know the school's drill. They know the school's choreography. They've rehearsed the actions of both the shooter and the victims over and over.
Yeah.
And through society, we've created also the lore and the costume and the imagery that the shooter is in many ways following a script of the way that they're going to act, the way they're going to dress, and the way that everybody else is going to respond to their actions. But what's the bit of conflict and the bit of asymmetry here is the school shooting drill, the lockdown drill. Every student and staff and teacher has to follow it, has to follow that choreography, but the attacker doesn't. The
Mhm.
attacker gets to improv. The attacker has read the book and decides then the way that they want to take the performance on their own. And kind of how do we deal with that point of conflict where your scripted actions are actually creating an advantage to your knowledgeable attacker?
Yeah. I think what what educators are also learning, like, because, and like, right, educators are in a very difficult space of having to perform a choreography and then also managing a lot of young people at the same time. So being kind of managers and half choreographer, half choreographers, but not right. And then, but something that an agency that they also have as well is that structured improvisation. So it's like um, this idea, right? If you get a particular cue, you have a certain set of actions that are probably like are the quote unquote best next steps to take. So I think that while yes, like oftentimes these students are very well aware of what the protocol is going to be, what their school is going to do, um, there still is that it isn't as rehearsed as like they're going to do the same thing every single time. Like not everyone is gonna like right hide under their desks, shut off the blinds, and close the doors. Right. A lot of people say too, like that's almost like a pointless thing because it's the middle of the day of school. Of course, there's kids inside the school. of course, there's kids inside these classrooms. Right. These kinds of moves that seem a little bit innocuous or ineffective, but structured improvisation is still like very key in the choreographies that are meant to like solve an issue. So whether or not, okay, we hear shots coming from this side, are we going to barricade, are we going to evacuate, can we break a window and jump out a second story, can we jump out, what's the next step, what do we have to our availability. So although yes, students are privy to what their school is going to do, I think, yeah, unfortunately, right, teachers are in this very difficult position of having to make quick decision makings and then altering the choreography and then leading their students through it in a safe way.
So kind of diving deeper into that. So the whole concept of performance as you've laid it out has to do a lot with permissions,
Mm.
granting permission, having power. And ultimately, when the performance is put on, there's both the display that the actors and company and producers are putting on, but there's also the audience who's viewing it. And they only exist in this symbiotic relationship that you're displaying something and people are taking it in.
Mm.
Uh, what happens if you don't have the production at all? If there's no lockdown drill at all, if that performance doesn't even exist, you remove the audience is the byproduct as well.
It is kind of like right, like the audience and the performers are kind of the same in these drills. It's like it is um especially I think for young people or the students, they're while they're practicing these things, they are also kind of part of the spectators learning like what their options are and
Or
how.
learning how to commit the attack.
Yeah. So it's like it like that the audience is an interesting like question to locate, I think, in this case. Because it could be also like parents, it could be a school district's a board. Like, are you doing these things? Are you doing it effectively? What kind of funding do you need to get it done? Right? Like, the audience is an interesting question to bring about that, but
because the classroom is typically a private space that's the purview of the teacher and the students,
right.
that has some kind of peripheral surveillance by parents through monitoring assignments or through an annual meeting, or
Right.
through the window in the door where the principal can peer in from time to time. But overall, it's a private space
Mm-hmm.
for the teacher and the student. But this larger kind of school security industrial complex and lockdown performance gives everybody the permission to view and gaze and critique the classroom
Yeah.
in a way that you wouldn't have social control over that space 20 years ago.
Right. Right. I think like one instance where that was really prevalent was the Uvalde shooting, with the like how long it took for police officers to go inside. And while, right, like, instead of, we weren't necessarily looking at the performance of the students or the teachers, in a way, yes, but also like the performance of the officers on duty. um it was kind of like a switch then, like a bait and switch, where it's like, okay, what's going to be your protocol, what is your performance? You don't know, like, and it invited a lot of, right, like, criticism and a lot of different, and that's the thing about these drills too, is that they're always going to be drafts, and they're always kind of like paying attention to what went wrong, how could this be more effective next time. And um and that's, which is really interesting in dance and performance studies. So there's this idea where you're performing a choreography that maybe was performed by someone before. You're kind of paying homage to them in a way. You're kind of dancing alongside ghosts, where, you're taking up somebody's bodily movements that once existed, didn't exist anymore, and now you're taking them up in yourself. And so I think, like, there is kind of like this underlying memorial aspect a lot of the times with drills, because they are drafts, and they're always kind of thinking what had happened, what was something fatal, and how can we address it. In that way, you're like, right, you're rewriting, you're re-choreographing and re-embodying scenarios that you wish you could have changed.
So it's the opportunity for this broader performance to try to rewrite our narrative of safety.
Right. And what could happen next time, right? And that's where it really gets trippy with temporality too, because you're performing things that happened in the past for something that might happen in the future.
And overwhelmingly will not happen in the
Yeah.
future. There are
Yeah.
130,000 K through 12 schools in the country with about 60 million students. And there are 2 or 3 planned attacks that take place at these schools each year. So most students are rehearsing for something that will never happen. There's kind of a growing, I'd say, consensus at this point that the lockdown drills probably cause more harm for most students
Yeah.
than the tangible, if any, benefit that they'd have, during an actual shooting. In my conversation with Dr. Tahir Rahman, the psychiatrist, he talked about the way that you are creating trauma and creating fear every single time, and that trauma and fear doesn't exist unless you have these drills that create it. And the accumulation of that over time can be what drives a vulnerable student to commit violence, or just creates a lot of psychological trauma for every other student to deal with. Kind of
Mhm.
what's your take from kind of the performance science aspect about how you avoid kind of creating trauma, or is that even possible? Does every performance carry that trauma?
Yeah, I think I think they're going to carry, I think this is going to be, I mean, right, like the dance side of me, like, right, the side of me that really looks at the body as an archive and as a source of information, right, says that like this, the trauma is already in our bodies, it's already being carried and passed down. um and I think, to the note right with the previous podcast with about the psychology of these drills, like in performance studies or in like theater studies, I've there's this idea, right, that the body doesn't know it's acting. So, right, like we see, things like about like Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, right? Like, and how like he kind of like faced all this trauma where like doing this role, and how it ended up being this like kind of a fatal role for him. Um, like that's right, like that's just one example, but like in any kind of like acting situation, or like or even movement or choreography, if you're doing something dangerous, if you're doing something where like, the situation is going to put you in a place of stress, like like this, like, okay, we're gonna have an intruder, what are we gonna do? Again, right, the body doesn't know it's acting. It's even though in our heads, right, or conceptually we know this is a rehearsal, putting our bodies still are just very important um harborers of information and archives and memories. So yeah, I think and that's what's hard too, right? Like I did this training, and I, although I am, of so many minds about it, and I'm really living in this gray of like, I really hate the systems these drills are perpetuating, that school-based policing perpetuates. At the other side, I know what to do if a guy comes in with a gun, and I'm not mad about that. I've got family, and that, I would, and it's a kind of like a superpower to know those things. But um again, I have such a distance, I still can maintain a distance to the subject because I'm not a high school student, I'm not an elementary school student, I also don't have children in the school system, and that's probably one of the only reasons I can do this work. And uh yeah, it's I think that if there's going to be safety taught and disseminated to students, right, like I think, right, like self-defense is still important. Um, but I think again, these performances of protection, these rehearsals and these drills are huge placebos to other problems of like why all these men are coming in and shooting people, all the time. It's like, it's where this is how anger is manifested. This is what vengeance looks like. This is just how men solve problems. And very few women solve problems, right? Like even like yesterday, the assassination of the CEO of United Healthcare. And at the same time, there was a shooting in California at a parochial school of a 5 and a 6-year-old. Like, I mean, it's just become this like symptom of a type of cultural masculinity that is much more difficult to address and a longer process. But I think we need to know that like this is what's kind of being upheld and what's going to keep going, which is also traumatic in itself.
Well,
And,
it's
yeah.
different through, and I think of it through the lens of performance
Mhm.
quite a bit, and back to our tension between both the performer and the audience is, there were about 30,000 gun suicides in the United States last year. Those are mostly unknown. Those are maybe a couple lines in the paper. There are not pictures of the crime scene on the news the next morning. That's something where we've said that the public doesn't have permission to know or view or gaze or
Mhm.
witness this. But mass shootings and school shootings overwhelmingly are violent public suicides. But it's a violent public suicide that the public is allowed to view. The public is allowed to look at. We say over and over, this is an unspeakable act that we're going to now talk about for the next couple hours.
Yeah.
So we've created a permission for the audience to look and understand and gaze on the bodies and experience the trauma when a suicide is committed in this violent public manner. And that's really, we've created a stage. We've created the opportunity for something that's pushed to the edge of society, that's normally hidden in the shadows, to be front and center for the whole audience to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, especially, right, like there are like, the amount that also of those that also don't get shown on TV, right, or shown in the media or make news. It's like, I don't know. I think I learned at like one of the school safety conferences that if there's a if there's like less than 3 casualties, it's not considered an active shooter anymore. There's kind of like in like the FBI, there's like a cap on how many, right, like how many deaths there have to be for it to be a
But
mass.
yeah, these are all just made up terms.
Yeah, but kind of
Active
qualification.
shooter, mass shooter, school
Yeah,
shooting. None of them are rooted in any sort of legal
right.
doctrine. Like they're
You're
just all
not the only
colloquial
ones.
terms.
Well, only ones keeping track, but like it's there are like qualifications for how bad it has to be for it to like kind of qualify our attention. And I think it is right to kind of like think about these as like suicides that we've like given permission for the public to kind of glean and learn on. And
There's a stranger, darker side of that as well. Is we have millions of military grade weapons that are sold in the country, and most people only fire them at a paper target because you're not even allowed to hunt deer with an AR-15.
right.
But when an AR-15 is used for its very specific purpose to kill as many people as possible in a public space, that is a display that we're allowed to look at. That's a performance we're allowed to look at. I think there's a kind of perverse fantasy that gets to play out every time somebody sees a weapon used for exactly what it's designed for. That it's a reminder, it's a performance of the power that weapon has, that the power that the person that holds it has. Before we go down that very dark road, I think we'll maybe kind of sum things up here, because there are kind of 4 specific audiences that I would like you to kind of give a closing piece about what they can learn about thinking about actions through the lens of choreography. And those audiences would be the police, a school administrator, a teacher, and a student. Kind of those 4 levels. What can somebody at each one of those levels take from choreography? Starting with the police.
Police. I think uh I think with the police it's I think I'd be, and I think they know. I feel like they think I don't know. I think they know it's like you are these public choreographers and you're managing public space, whether it be, you know, driving around a construction site and around, in a certain pathway, or crossing the street, or in a protest. Choreography is the nature of your job and managing space. Keep it moving is a choreographic imperative. Hey, you freeze. That's a choreographic imperative. So the fact that, it is a power, right? Like I'm, again, like as a dance and performance person, like, right, like your body is your source of information and it's your power. And if you're controlling other bodies en masse, it's something to pay attention to because it's widely abused. And then I think the next level, right, of like administrator and teacher, I think that you're these choreo managers, and in this horrible in between space of managing your own body and your own safety, and then also being responsible for young people. It's it's an awful responsibility. I think it's this is a horrible thing that is part of it's teachers' jobs in the US.
Well, in most days, it's a good responsibility because getting all the kids to run the same way on the soccer field,
Right. You
or
gotta,
getting the whole class to stand up and perform the play is,
yeah, you
you
gotta
know,
get from point A to point B. And right, like that is a choreography, right? And
getting everyone lined up in the hallway in
right.
alphabetical order.
But it's hard in that case of like an emergency to kind of then go from being the teacher, like the guide or the leader, um, to being this mediator between a choreography and then your students and your own safety. And like, right, like students, I mean, I think like, I think maybe like day to day, I don't know if it like really, I don't know what students notice about drills. It might be just a break from the school day. It's just a way to just like see your friends in some way, or like it like the same way like fire drills were, like any kind of other like public safety drill. But I think keep paying attention to the systems. Like what's nothing is for movement is never for movement's sake, is what I'll say.
So then one last question, if anybody listening to this, whether they're in law enforcement or administration or parents, if somebody wants to learn more about choreography or kind of the science of movement, what would you recommend that they look for?
I think, you can always reach out to me, read the piece. I have another piece in open access journal called Conversations Across the Field of Dance Studies. And I talk more about the choreography specifically in that, like as a dance studies piece. And I think just learning about also the social movements that are behind school to prison pipeline and also the prison industrial complex. Learn about abolition. There's a great new book out called Abolition Feminism Now. That's kind of a short introduction into like what that movement looks like and what it entails. And as well as right, Derica Purnell's Becoming Abolitionists. And from that, I think like in this talk, just start paying attention to like why you're compelled to move in certain ways. Is it because of a reaction? Is it your own impetus? Is it an outside impetus? It's pretty trippy, but there's no limits to it. At least I don't think so.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much. This was an amazing discussion. There's a link in the show notes if you want to read it to the paper. The thread is now choreography, temporality, and the active shooter drill. This was Shannon Woods. I'll have a link to her bio as well. So Shannon, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.